So, thank you. This week, as printed in your bulletin and promised, our preachers for today were to be Pastor Mary and Charlie Kidder. Charlie is ill, so we'll be lifting him and others in prayer later on. So I've been asked to read for him. So the words that I read are Charlie's thoughts, not that we're usually ever too far apart, but just to let you know that that's where our preparation came from this week, which is the four of us.
So hear Charlie's voice as he reads.
I'll try not to be a kidder.
So last week we heard a story about the prophet Elisha, and today we're going forward about 50 years or so to hear words from the prophet Micah. Micah began his ministry about 50 years after Elisha finished his. So Micah lived about the same time as the prophet Isaiah. But whereas Isaiah was a resident of Jerusalem, which is to say he was an urban kind of guy, big city kind of guy, Micah was from a rural area. He was from a village to the southeast of Jerusalem. So Micah brings a slightly different attitude, a sort of agrarian, of country sort of perspective, in particular to the religious authority that was in the temple in Jerusalem. Isaiah was in Jerusalem with it, so he had a slightly different view of it all. So this is the latter part of the 8th century BCE. So dates are a little weird here because they go backwards. So Micah begins his ministry around 725 BC, and it's a ministry mostly to the southern kingdom of Judah. Israel and Judah are divided at this point. And and he goes forward from there, and the numbers go down in BCE. So one thing to keep in mind with these readings is that Israel and Judah were being attacked by all their neighbors. And Judah in 701 was in siege, was being in, I did the words wrong. Assyria, the country of Assyria, sieged.
Conquered.
They didn't quite conquer, they were sieging them.
Okay.
I don't know if that's a verb. They were besieging, yes, Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is surrounded by enemies. And so some of that is kind of coming through in how people are in fear and what he says to them. So we're going to read 3 passages from the book of Micah. We're going to read some from the 1st chapter, a little from the 5th chapter, and then a little from the 6th chapter.
So we're journeying through Micah. Listen for the story of Micah 1, verses 2 through 5. Hear you, peoples, all of you. Listen, O earth, and all that is in it. And let the Lord God be a witness against you, the Lord from his holy temple. For lo, the Lord is coming out of his place, and will come down and tread upon the high places of the earth. Then the mountains will melt under him, and the valleys will burst open like wax near the fire, like waters poured down a steep place. All this is for the transgression of Jacob, and for the sins of the house of Israel. What is the transgression of Jacob? Is it not Samaria? And what is the high place of Judah? Is it not Jerusalem?
So Micah begins with a statement of God's judgment on Israel and Judah, both. Although the bulk of his words get spoken to the southern kingdom of Judah. In early times, this phrase, the high places, very early times, people went literally to high places, literally like on hills. And it was places where often people had really overwhelming experiences of the presence of God, and they worshipped there. Sometimes it was to the God of Israel, the God of Abraham and Jacob. Sometimes it was to other gods, but they felt a closeness to God's there. At this point, early on, there was no temple in Jerusalem, and it was okay to worship in these high places. So for example, Samuel, then we get told that the prophet Samuel goes to a high place outside his hometown and worships there. He worships the God of Abraham and Jacob. This is okay. But once the temple gets built, then you're supposed to worship God there. And the temple authorities were very strong about this. And the people were still, both in the northern and southern kingdom, were still worshiping in the high places, in these hills and these different places. And now whether they were worshiping other gods, certainly they were doing that. whether they were also just kind of thumbing their nose at the authority in Jerusalem and saying, I'm going to go worship God where I want. We don't know. But by the time of Micah, this association with the high places is very definitely a sin. It's very definitely you're worshiping other gods versus you're worshiping the one true God. The description of God trampling the high places is poetic language. It's not literal. So please don't picture God as some kind of giant white monster trampling across the countryside like the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man from Ghostbusters. He's really saying that the mountains will tremble, the valleys will melt, that everything will just be in turmoil. The words are meant to catch people's imagination and also to catch their attention, to let them know that this is very serious and that God is speaking to them. Sit up, listen, God's speaking to you.
Charley thinks, or his thoughts are, so what is happening historically at this time is that God's chosen people have backslid and are now into idol worship in the high places. You kind of have to wonder about a God who continually loves his children, who continually loves his chosen people so much that he continues to save them and rescue them from themselves. And then again, are there any of us who are different? We also deal in idol worship. Well, maybe not this particular group in the church right now.
We do.
But it only takes just a brief inspection to see what is going on in the world around us. A number of us have touched on this several times in the last few weeks, and it is a recurring theme. The fact that the Israelites began worshiping idols is not significantly different from us even 2,500 years after the fact. We try to keep up with the Joneses. We need to get the latest and greatest cars, video games, computers, and other gadgets. These are not significantly different than idol worship.
This first passage in Micah fervently believes that God loves us. But he also fervently believes that God judges our actions. So now we move to chapter 5, verses 2 through 5a.
But you, O Bethlehem of Ephrathah, who are one of the little clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to rule in Israel, whose origin is from of old, from ancient days. Therefore he shall give them up until the time when she who is in labor has brought forth. Then the rest of his kindred shall return to the people of Israel, and he shall stand and feed his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. And they shall live secure, for now he shall be great to the ends of the earth, and he shall be the one of peace. Micah tells the people that God wants to be on a level playing field with the people. He wants them to know that one is coming who will rescue them and protect them. And he offers them hope in these passages that one will come to rule in peace and whose vintage will be to the great ends of the earth. He also points to Bethlehem as being the location where the ruler will rise up.
This is the message of hope that we Christians associate with the season of Advent, because in this promised one who's born to save his people, we see the Christ child. Remember that at this time the nations of Israel and Judah were under attack all the time, and they were being conquered. So to be assured of forgiveness, to know that God forgives you, that's a wonderful thing. But to believe that this God will not only forgive you, but will protect you and your family and keep you safe, that's a whole other level of comforting. Micah is assuring us that God is a forgiving God who wants us to be reconciled with each other and with God, and to know that God will care for us. We go down to Micah 6, beginning at chapter 3. And this is God speaking. O my people, what have I done to you? In what have I wearied you? Answer me. For I brought you up from the land of Egypt and redeemed you from the house of slavery. And I sent before you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. O my people, remember now what King Balak of Moab devised, what Balaam, son of Beor, answered him, and what happened from Shittim to Gilgal, that you may know the saving acts of the Lord. And the people respond, with what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? What does God really want from us? How does God mean for us to live our lives? These questions are at the core of this passage. God begins by claiming the people as God's own. My people, God says. The people with whom God has a covenant. Addressing the nations as my people is a way for each person who's listening to understand that God is speaking to them. Remember what I've done, God says, and then rehearses that salvation history. Talks about how they were brought safely out of Egypt, redeemed from slavery, guided to the promised land. And those other verses with all the unpronounceable names, those are about events that happened between Egypt and the promised land. They were saved over and over again from other kings, from danger on the way. So then the people speak up and say, well, what should we do? So the people list a bunch of things that they could do, possible sacrifices they could make. And some people read that list as, kind of maybe sarcastic, or these are like impossible, just really exaggerated things. But I think we should take them really seriously in the sense that they're asked in a particular order and they all have a meaning. It begins with an animal. You think in general of sacrifices in the Old Testament, they're mostly sacrificing an animal. Now, you could sacrifice an animal from the time it was 8 days old, but once it was a year old, it was much more valuable. If you think about it, you've had to feed that animal for a year. If you're a well-to-do person, you've got a bunch of animals, you've got 3,000 cows out in the field, for example. One cow that lives to be a year, that's not a big overhead for you. But if you're a very poor person, and you've only got 1 or 2 animals, to feed an animal for an entire year makes it much more valuable. This is a gift that would be a big thing for a poor person. The next thing that's listed is thousands of rams, thousands, tens of thousands of rivers of oil. And those are offerings that royalty might bring. And in fact, in the book of 1 Chronicles, when David and Solomon are making offerings when they're beginning to build the temple, it says, they offered sacrifices and burnt offerings to the Lord, 1,000 bulls, 1,000 rams, and 1,000 lambs, with their libations and sacrifices in abundance. It's not a sacrifice that normal people would make, but this is a sacrifice that people will have been acquainted with. It is something that very wealthy people like royalty would do. The final sacrifice, shall I give my firstborn? Some people say, well, that means maybe they were still sacrificing children. Now that could be true, but I think it's much more likely that they're talking about dedicating a child, because that was another way to give your child to God. And again, think about people, and in particular, Micah is coming from a very rural perspective. You have children, what do your children help you with? They help you to earn your living. If you're a woman and your husband dies, the person who takes care of you is your son. So to give away that son to worship, to service in the temple for their whole life is a major thing, because that's your own well-being there. So if you think back to Samuel was given to the priest Eli to serve as a Nazirite. His entire life he was given away as soon as he was weaned. So this is probably 2 to 3, maybe 4 years old. He was given away by his mother, Hannah. Samson was also a Nazirite. So these are some of the ways that organized official religion at the time told people to worship God. And that's why they're saying, is this what we should do? Are these the things we should do? So think about what would be our equivalent practices today. What does the church tell us we should do? We should show up on Sundays for church, or Saturday nights if you're at a Saturday night church. We should show up for Sunday school. We should study our Bibles. We should pray. We should, if we have lots of money, we should give lots of money to the church. If we're so inclined, maybe we answer a call to be a missionary or to be an ordained minister and dedicate our lives to church. Micah isn't saying that we shouldn't do those things, but what he's saying is that there is more to worshiping God than ticking things off a list. Went to church, tick. Went to Sunday school, tick. Gave money this month, tick. Yeah, went to seminary, tick. These are all things that are what we do. And what's important, Micah and God are saying, is how we do these things. So, how we do them is what gets answered in the last verse. We're told to do justice. Now, you could give away a coat, tick, or you could give away a coat because you're called to do that and you feel compassion for a person who needs a coat. There's a big difference in God's eyes. The Hebrew word that's translated here as do justice refers not only to justice in the sense of like civil courts, it also refers to what any one of us might do in our own lives. So a teacher teaches with justice by teaching all their students, not singling some out, not teaching them all. Somebody who runs a business does justice by serving everyone equally, by not diminishing respect for anyone. Each of us has in our own lives some way in which we act with justice. There's a dialogue between John the Baptist and his listeners in Luke where they say to him, "What can we do, John? What can we do?" And he says, "Whoever has 2 coats must share with anyone who has none. Whoever has food must do likewise." And he says to the tax collectors, "Collect no more than the amount prescribed for you." To the soldiers, he says, "Don't extort money from anyone by threats or false accusation and be satisfied with your wages." These are all things that were very common in those times, to extort money or to charge over. We're called to do the things that are right, and we're called to do them because we feel moved by God to do them, not because we get a star on our chart or something. Kindness. Do justice, kindness. Kindness translates a Hebrew word which is generally translated as steadfast love. It's more than just kindness. It's a compassion, a magnificent compassion and mercy that is loyal. It's kindness that doesn't go away. It's kindness that is bigger than just kindness. And if you think about it, the way that God loves us, that's steadfast love. That's how we're called to treat other people and to love other people. To walk humbly with your God isn't about ticking off all these things that showcase our personal piety. It's about obedience to whatever God calls us to. And that certainly includes worship, but it extends out from worship to include all the activities of our life. If we should wonder what all this looks like, he has showed you what is good. The reminder of God's saving acts is kind of the motto. God started out by saying, "Here's what I did for you. I saved you from Pharaoh. I redeemed you from slavery. I brought you in safety all the way to the promised land. I got you here, and I still love you in spite of the fact that you're faithless. You're off worshiping other people after all this stuff I did for you. I still love you and want to be in a relationship with you." That's how we are called to be in our lives, with all the people we know. God loves us. God judges our actions. But God forgives us and cares for us and wants us to be reconciled, both with each other and with God. And in order for that to happen, this reconciliation, God tells us how we should live.
Take to heart the answer that is given in his passage. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? Here's a challenge for each of you to attempt in the forthcoming week. With every person you meet and have a conversation with, do not allow any negative thoughts about the other person to enter your mind. Keep that person held in your highest regard. With every person you have conflict with, Treat the conflict with love for your fellow person and take a mental note on how well that conflict was resolved. And spend just 1 week constantly walking humbly with God. Some of us in the room already do this. I think maybe most of us do not. Since we are all listening to this message right now, then it is highly likely that we will each do this with each other in our conversations and conflicts. And I know I saw some smiling faces, so...
Over coffee after.
Yeah. And we should see rather quickly how well that works for each of us. As for walking humbly with God, then at the end of a week, we can perform a self-inventory to see how well we did. So let's move forward to the New Testament. Go to the Gospel of Matthew, and we're going to read from chapter 9, verses 9 through 13. Matthew 9 to 13. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. And as he sat at dinner in the house, many tax collectors and sinners came and were sitting with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" But when he heard this, he said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners." The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So it sounds a lot like he's quoting Micah, in very similar words, but he's actually quoting the prophet Hosea, who wrote, "For I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings." Jesus believed that his mission as the Messiah was to welcome the religious outcasts of his day into the fellowship of God's people. Not to come and tell all the religious people, "Yeah, you're doing a good job," and pat them on the back. He was there to welcome those who weren't welcome into the church. So think about, who are today's tax collectors and sinners? Who are the people that we don't welcome into the church nowadays? This church is really, really welcoming. I'd be hard put to find any image of anyone in my mind that this church would not welcome. But this church is really unusual. So many churches have a long list of people that they don't welcome. And you have to remember that most of the people out there on the street have experience with those churches, if they have experience with church at all. So it's more important than ever that we tell them that we're Christians and we welcome them. And the question is, how can we do a better job of welcoming them into the fellowship of God's people? And what does that even mean, to welcome them into the fellowship of God's people? To be welcoming. I mean, I can name a lot of things that I've found not welcoming in the past in churches, but we need to think about what that really means and how we can actually do it well. So originally, we were going to stop here and invite you guys to think about those questions and talk about it. But what happened last week? Your session met last Thursday night, and I wanted to share with you, instead of what we planned, I wanted to share with you just a quick description of what was discussed and decided at that meeting. So we met, and part of the meeting was elder training, and part of it was sort of strategic, let's look forward kind of discussion. It was limited to just the elders. It wasn't to be secret in any way. It wasn't to shut anyone out. It was mostly just to keep people focused and to keep the group small enough that some of the quieter members of session would be able to speak up. So we did some elder training, and then we talked about where is this church going to be? I asked them, what do you see as the future of this church? And I was somewhat afraid that people might say, well, I don't think we have a future. And so, okay, that'll be a short meeting. But that wasn't at all what happened. We started talking about what our strengths are. Our strengths, we were told, were dining and eating and fellowship, a relaxed spiritual atmosphere, the fact that we've worked to make ourselves visible to the community, all those things that we're welcoming. And we wondered about what our weaknesses were. And one of the major weaknesses we came up with is that we haven't had any kind of focused vision for the last few years. We've been talking about a lot of things. It was also pointed out to us that our location is a really, really good strength, because we are sitting here right across from a park where a lot of people come. So one of the things that happened in the meeting is that Charlie had been thinking about certain things when they went up to the conference up in Oklahoma last week, or that just last week. And he'd been thinking about things, and I'd been thinking about things, and they sort of all came together. And then Joaquin and Rusty and Japhet all had other ideas that kind of really fed into it. And what we thought about was, we've talked about building out here. We've talked about a big building. Well, we can't afford a big building, and a big building has the drawback that you build a building, no one can see what's going on inside of it. One of the things we are not good at is building relationships with our neighbors. We're good at reaching out, we're good at welcoming, but we aren't any of us really very brave about going up to neighbors and saying, "Hi, I'd like to get to know you." Right? We just don't want to be, I don't know, hurt, embarrassed. We don't want to bother people, whatever. We're just not strong in that. But one of the things we talked about was having, instead of having a big building over here, one of the other things we've talked about is having, help me with the word.
Pavilion.
Pavilion. Pavilion's the right word. A big pavilion. We wanted a big kitchen because this is a congregation that cooks. But a kitchen and a pavilion, as opposed to a kitchen and a big dining hall or fellowship hall or anything like that. We talked about adding bathrooms and showers and even laundry facilities so that people who don't have a place to shower or do their laundry, for whatever reason, can come and use those facilities. And when we started talking about this pavilion, we started thinking about all the different things that we could use it for. And we could use it for, what I had been thinking about was having us host, not conferences, but talks, or host people who might give talks, not just to us as a church, but to churches in the valley or the community. So, for example, Habitat for Humanity is here in the valley, but they are only in Brownsville. And I would love to have them come and talk to the rest of the valley, and have maybe our sister churches in the valley all work with us to do something with Habitat. We talked about bringing PDA in, pedestrian disaster assistance, to come in and do a talk. Then we started opening up more. What about if we do the cooking classes that we've talked about doing forever? People don't know how to do even just basic cooking. I know one of the things I was reading the other day, we talked about how people aren't eating well. We eat a lot of junk food. People don't know how to cook anymore. People don't have a lot of money, and they don't know basic things. A lot of people, like, I'm a really bad cook. What's an easy way to cook an egg? Eggs are cheap, good protein. Instead of going to the store and buying a bag of chips, I could buy a dozen eggs and have a whole bunch of really good meals. I buy the chips because I don't cook. That's really bad, and I'm trying to change that. But there's more people like me who also don't know how to cook, or just don't really know where to start, or don't have experience. We could run really basic cooking classes to show people how to cook inexpensive meals and give them practice at it. If we have a big kitchen that we can open up and let people practice. Because I don't want my first time I make scrambled eggs to be for my husband, and he says, "Don't ever cook these again," because they came out so badly, right? You want to have a place where you can practice. Yeah, he's a little pickier than I am. I eat anything. So that's one thing. I know Paul has been really wanting to teach Filipino cooking. We've had lots and lots of ideas, the classes that we could give. We could have someone, I know there's people with the city or with the state or with somebody that have contacted us in the past that can come and give a talk about nutrition. People who can come and give talks about parenting. We can partner with other people. We're small, we don't have to do it all. But if we build a pavilion, I don't want to say we'll build it, they will come, but people can see it from the park and they can see what's going on. This is a way for us to do outreach to the community, to have something for the community. And it's not being done so that people will come and join our church. That's not the thought. The thought is that we have something we can give to the community. We have a way to share that will help the community. There's more. I'm trying to think what more was. This is supposed to be a quick overview. What have I forgotten, guys? Japhet said. Japhet's a senior in high school. This is going online. You mind me saying this? Yes, you mind? Okay.
Wait.
So.
I don't think you understood. Is it okay for her to? Yeah.
Oh, okay. So Japhet's a senior in high school, and he volunteered. I was asking him, what do people talk about? Where do people hear about things? You know, you live here in La Feria, can you explore for us how we can best get the word out to people? And he said, well, people will be over at the park, they'll see. But one of the really big things in this community is quinceañeras. And he's a senior in high school. We have, free publicity in the high school for one more year, a little less than one more year. But just a quinceañera is an important thing for families, and it's a horribly expensive thing. Now, it's not the same to have an open pavilion as to have a closed room, and so that may not appeal to some people, but it is an alternative option that we can offer. Again, to be able to do something for the community. Oops, I ran out of steam.
That's okay.
So, that's what your session came up with. Not only did they come up with all these ideas, but we made a commitment. All of us have assignments, and we're going to try and get this going. This month, we're working on things. So, if you want to know more about this, you can catch us next Wednesday at dinner, or you can come to the session meeting. It'll be on the 26th. That's a Monday, the last Monday of the month. And that's going to be the majority of our business that night. We'll be talking about this, so you can hear more and put in your 2 cents.
I think. Yeah, you can.
Yes. Applaud yourself.
I think in the season of Thanksgiving, for our session to have that kind of vision, I think we're set up perfectly for the theme of Thanksgiving, and we're thankful for our session and their commitment, and their vision, and their working for this congregation.
We are really blessed in this congregation, not only with a very welcoming group of people, but with a group of people that gets along really well, and that has ideas and is willing to talk about them and develop them and think about doing something with them. And is willing to do whatever it takes, not worried about, oh my gosh, it's going to change and what's going to happen, and oh, well, people leave garbage and we'll have to clean up their garbage. You just don't have that kind of conversation here. People are really good. You have a really good session. God is good.
All the time.
All the time.
God is good.